What you'll hear next wouldn't be possible without the support of readers, viewers, and listeners like you, and organizations such as the Berlin Science Week, New York City Economic Development Corporation, and the Rita Allen Foundation. Access the network by visiting civicscitv.org.
Mapping the global landscape of civic science by dissecting new insights from researchers, practitioners, and leaders in academia, government, for-profit, and non-profit organizations. This is Questions of the Day with Fanuel Muindi.
Question: how do scientists and science engagers address the diversity of languages when it comes to science engagement and communication? Well, of course, English is a primary language of instruction and communication in science. But think of this: Africa alone has over 2,000 languages. What then? How do we facilitate science engagement in a way that people can understand, relate to, connect with, and contribute to in their language of choice? This is a topic we have briefly explored previously in talking with Paige Giroux and Rami Traurig about the usage of American Sign Language in science communication, and also with Rania Verk around what should be done given the lack of linguistic diversity in scientific publications. Well, in this special series on the Questions of the Day program, the founder of Under the Microscope and Civic TV's Africa Special Correspondent, Stephanie Okeyo, takes my seat and explores how different individuals and initiatives are using language to enhance science engagement in Africa. So you're in for a really nice treat. Stephanie takes a multifaceted approach to understanding this area by asking thought-provoking questions to various experts. These are scholars and practitioners working from different perspectives, including technology, education, research, edutainment, and linguistics. She had the opportunity to talk to various individuals representing 5 projects and initiatives that cover topics such as the role of policy in facilitating science education and communication in mother tongue languages, the cultural shift and Africans' attitudes towards their languages and views of Africa as a global scientific contributor, the exit and entry points of local languages in education, and so much more. Well, enough from me. As I said, you're in great hands in this special series. So here is Stephanie.
Thank you, Dr. Buguzi, for joining us today. Dr. Buguzi is a science communicator and also the founder of MwanaSayansi. I'm going to let Dr. Buguzi introduce himself and tell us more about his work.
I like calling myself a science journalist because I write science stories here and there, and I use my press card to gain access to interviews and work as a journalist. And I earn from journalism. But as you know, I work as a freelance journalist, specifically on medical science and other aspects of science. Mainly, I write for SciDev.net. I've written articles for Lancet, Nature. I've written for Gavi a number of times on vaccines, and Wired in the UK, several others. But on the ground here in Tanzania, I have focused much on finding ways I can help my fellow journalists in a country where journalism is predominantly Swahili, or the language of the media is predominantly Swahili. So I try to help my fellow journalists by creating platforms that inspire them or even open up their mind to some of the avenues in science communication or science journalism, because I myself, I have a background in medical science. Then I went for journalism here at the University of Dar es Salaam. Then later on, specialized in science communication at the University of Sheffield. So having this background, I reached a point where I felt like I need to create a platform or platforms to help like create exemplary journalistic outlets that can lead the way, and which journalists can find important as sources, but also as learning platforms. But as I also continue to play the role of informing the public, like any other journalist. So that's how I ended up founding MwanaSayansi as a newspaper that basically focuses on communicating science to the natives, the Swahili speakers, because as I highlighted, as I hinted, you know, the language of the media in Tanzania is Kiswahili. You will just find a few newspapers which have been in existence since colonial times, and one or two that were formed later. But the rest were the digital platforms, and actually the information that the government authorities finding as very important in terms of policy changes and which new outlets that can hold them to account, and outlets that they fear the public that could expose them to the public are in Swahili. Yeah, if you want to hide information here in Tanzania, just write it in English. It will just be read by a few people. But if you put it in Swahili outlets, that means everybody now is almost getting informed. So the MwanaSayansi founding actually came along those lines. We want to also penetrate that kind of audience that speaks Swahili, but now with science. It's not simple. You really need to find ways. So one of the ways we try to do is the name of the newspaper. You see here, the naming of the newspapers here in Tanzania is a bit unique. You will hear of MwanaNchi. MwanaNchi is I think it's the leading newspaper. It's a Swahili newspaper by Nation Media Group. The National Media Group is also found in Kenya.
Yeah.
We have Nipashe.
We also have that.
That was also in Kenya. But also, you know, that nomenclature, MwanaSayansi, we have MwanaHalisi. It's a very popular newspaper that is hard hitting. Been closed and opened a number of times. MwanaHalisi. There is in Tanzania. Mwanahabari. You know, such that Tanzanians have sort of become accustomed to such names. And we thought that the way to penetrate is to come up with MwanaSayansi.
Yeah, so that it resonates with the culture, the naming culture. And
exactly. Briefly, that this newspaper is run by a startup company that we founded. It's called ResearchCom. ResearchCom comes from research communication. So we work with researchers to help them communicate science better, giving them communication strategies here and there. So MwanaSayansi is a newspaper owned by the company that actually does this sort of business. We do capacity building. We support them in some science communication trainings and solutions. It could be report writing, whatever. So MwanaSayansi follows under ResearchCom.
And Dr. Buguzi, because you have both, you understand the national landscape and also have had an international, also understand both the national and international landscape in terms of science communication, science journalism. Tanzania is a little bit unique because, as you say, Kiswahili is the main communication. But if you look in countries like, for example, where I'm from, Kenya, if you think of health communication, is mostly done in English. And the conversation is that most science communication, science journalism is done in English or sometimes French because that's the language of science. So how do you find it different in terms of being in a country or working in a country whereby actually the native language or the local language is the primary speaking language, even in health communication compared to other areas. So for you, what are the insights or the experiences or the lessons or the takeaways you're taking, for example, in countries that are trying to do science communication, science journalism in local languages to reach more people? And Tanzania is actually way ahead when you look in that angle.
Yeah, actually, when you talk of science, you speak of evidence, evidence about how things work. Because science is about phenomena, how things change, how phenomena, how things occur. Why certain things happen. But to prove why certain things happen, or even to prove that a certain organism causes a certain disease, you need to have the evidence. Mm-hmm. You remember the scientists who decided to, you remember the gastric ulcer issue. Somebody had to swallow something in order to prove.
Yeah, to prove, yeah. I remember that, yeah.
To give the evidence. So, so where is the science? Where is this science? This science is in research. Mm-hmm. Now you have to prove something, so you have to conduct research. And this research, the way to put it up there that this is evidence, it has to be scrutinized, peer-reviewed, and put up in science journals. But then these are the scientists producing the science and putting it up in journals. And most likely in English, as you said, English dominates as the language of science. So, and if you look at the way scientists approach science, mm-hmm. They believe that the largest platforms where they can expose their science is in scientific journals, and the largest, most popular scientific journals are in English. Mm-hmm. So, and it so happens now, more problematic now, is that scientists, whenever they are talking about that science, they meet their fellow scientists and talk about what is already in the journals. And then it ends up in boardrooms, it ends up in conferences, it ends up in that, cohort of people.
It's a closed.
And then they discuss amongst themselves. The best they can do is bring policymakers in their forums. Mm-hmm. And then the policymakers at times don't even understand at times. And there are policymakers who may not understand. Because if you try to look at research, you'll come to realize that the largest percentage of decision makers do not know science, are not scientists. They may know, but they are not scientists. So, what I'm trying to say is that when these scientists communicate, they communicate to a small group of people. Mm-hmm. But they may have the evidence, they may have the science that people need to hear and understand. Mm-hmm. So how does this science reach the people? It is supposed to be through the media, through various channels that can find their way into the public, and then people get that information. Okay, in Kenya, the dominant language is English. Here in Tanzania, the dominant language is Swahili. So the scientists here in Tanzania, they communicate largely in English when they are talking to their fellow scientists. Mm-hmm. They do not communicate in Swahili. So who is going to help take that information from them to the public? The public that speaks Swahili. So you come to realize it's the media. Now the media is trying to communicate that kind of science from the scientists. First of all, there's a language barrier here. You come to realize, if you come to Tanzania one time and take you around and you visit a number of research, you come to realize that majority of the journalists here are very comfortable communicating in Swahili. And I have, running this company, sometimes you get consultancies of organizations calling us to connect them with the media. Mm-hmm. So when you are at a scientific conference, you come out to, you want journalists to capture what is in the scientific conference. Journalists usually complain a lot They say we've come, but the researchers are just speaking English. They're speaking tough vocabularies. They have tough topics with tough titles. They can't find on their own. They can't break through to get the science. You understand?
Yeah.
So it becomes challenging there on that scientists, despite the fact that they know information has to reach the people in a country like Tanzania, where they need to communicate in Swahili to reach majority of the people, but they choose to communicate among themselves, then creating a large gap. That gap affects the journalists, and then if it affects the journalists, you can imagine it will affect also the end users of that information. So I tend to interpret it this way, that there is some sluggish sort of progress in terms of making this information cross from science in English, science from the science itself, now being converted to science that the public can understand. So there's a chain of processes that need to sort of, I don't know, broken down or simplified or sort of made. There has to be some sort of a mechanism to help bridge these gaps, and then for help the people, the end users, get the science from the hard facts embedded in science journals and scientific conferences. This is the experience, at least I have.
And as someone who's within this space, do you feel, or do you think also lack of vocabulary is a problem in terms of scientific vocabulary into Swahili? Is that an issue or not? I ask this because Tanzania is a little bit unique with the secondary school science subjects who were previously taught in Swahili. So if you compare with countries, for example, like Kenya or other countries like DRC that still speak Swahili, for us, if we say the education is, we have vocabulary gaps, can be a little bit relevant because we stop learning Swahili or science. We never even learned science in Swahili. But for Tanzania, it's a little bit different, even though that has changed over the years. So as somebody who does, I will say, communication or even translation in terms of science done communicated in English, and then put it in a way that is digestible for people who are Swahili speakers, do you find there is lack of scientific vocabulary within the scientific space in Swahili, or that is not an issue because of the school structure?
The school structure actually is from primary school, most public schools teach in Swahili. And then when you begin secondary school, Kiswahili just becomes a subject, and then all the rest is done in English up to university level. This is a challenge that has been debated over and over again in Tanzania, and the debate doesn't end, whether we should adopt Kiswahili throughout or adopt English throughout, or leave, some even propose radically that everything should be in Swahili. Why the argument being, why are countries like China able to do their stuff in Chinese, and such challenges. But the challenges that exist with the vocabulary are obvious at times. Look at this, for instance, I should say the rise of artificial intelligence. Now there is a debate when people began to talk about artificial intelligence, when it became popular. We've had media, including our own newspaper, because the first time it came out, I was asked by BBC the same question, and we were by then struggling to find the best way to write artificial intelligence. And the question was, how do you write artificial intelligence in Swahili? So we used to say akili bandia. I think akili bandia is some sort of I should say it has some bad connotation.
Yeah.
It sounds like, something bandia is like fake.
Fake, yeah. It's like.
Yeah. But then, some
it's
debate
fake
around,
mind.
but the media, yeah. But then the media has been using it quite widely, even international media, BBC, they have been using akili bandia. And that has infiltrated even here in Tanzania. So, so over time, the Baraza la Kiswahili, the council that deals with the Kiswahili language here in Tanzania, came up with another vocabulary, saying akili, instead of calling it akili bandia, artificial intelligence is actually akili mnemba. Akili mnemba. Now, introducing it to people who already know akili bandia stuff. But then there are other arguments from other scientists who are saying, this should be akili tarakinishi. Akili tarakinishi, that is like, like computerized sort of mind or whatever. So there is, as technology rises, as technology advances, we also face that challenge of how does the language match with the technology. But kumbuka, we also have a history of coining our own words, scientific words in Kiswahili. Taking an example of the COVID-19 pandemic, when it hit, very interestingly, everybody was talking about face mask. And then all of a sudden, people went to check from Baraza la Kiswahili. How do you call a face mask? Because how are you going to tell the people in the villages there face mask?
Yeah.
They only know Kiswahili. They don't know English. So how do you communicate with them? So the word barakoa gained prominence. Barakoa, face mask. So the mask that we're using, everybody now in Tanzania, if you say barakoa, they know. People started selling barakoa, on the streets and everywhere. Barakoa became, a popular word. But that came from the controversies of the COVID-19. How do you communicate? But then the other issue is we are talking about COVID-19. The stuff, trying to COVID. We began by saying COVID-19, but then COVID itself is still English.
Yeah.
How do you make it people understand? So the government, through Baraza la Kiswahili, they came up with ugonjwa wa virusi vya corona. So in Tanzania, if you, in short, it's called uviko. So if you say uviko 19, uviko 19 is ugonjwa wa virusi vya corona 19. So COVID is just, we threw it away. So if you say uviko in Tanzania, they know you mean the disease.
But
the virus is corona. Yeah.
And as someone who does capacity building, particularly in your case with your organization, for science journalism and science communication in Swahili, what do you think there is no magic bullet, but what would you think will be the starting point for these linguistic challenges?
Yeah, I think the official channels that we are relying on need to be robust in terms of matching with the technology and communicating these changes, and actually being at the forefront, making sure that they shape the way we communicate using the language. If new words emerge, they should be at the forefront to gather information and coming up with, the words that can shape the way we communicate things in our local language. So with journalism now, very interestingly, journalism. As journalists, we tend to rely on official sources, official nomenclature. As a journalist myself, when I am faced with a challenge in terms of how do I communicate this word, my ultimate solution is to go to the website by Baraza la Kiswahili Tanzania, look it out, and they are the authority. Nobody else, they are the authority. And we've been doing this quite a lot, including when we founded MwanaSayansi. some of the words, like I told you, how do we communicate them? We've been going to them. But then, for instance, in trying to help journalists communicate better, sometimes you need somebody who will lead the way in trying to make someone who is a journalist who will lead the way to try to connect the matching, the advances in technology and the changes in language with the journalist. For instance, what we are doing currently, just a little bit, we have created a platform that actually talks about research in Swahili. It's called utafiti.tz. It promotes the native knowledge of the country. It promotes the research of the country, but it has a Swahili name. It has a Swahili domain, which we now encourage journalists to click on it and find press releases or news releases written in Kiswahili about research. Because for us, we are dedicated to communicating science. We tend to be ahead in terms of finding out what are the changes that are going on currently. So if they can receive press releases in Swahili and about research and about science, it means it helps them shape the way they communicate. And what we do for us, we try to build the trust so that the journalists find us as a reliable source of communicating science, but also as a reliable source of, as people who can shape the way the science or the journalism is done, especially in the field of science. So in a nutshell, I should say that journalists need to find and work hard to keep, in close, I should say, connection with the official sources that shape the way the language advances and changes with the technology and the science. This is inescapable. There is no way they will escape this, or we will escape this.
And I also find it quite interesting with the Utafiti platform that you have realized this gap and also formed a bridge in terms of to make work easier for people who are communicating in this science news or doing science communication in itself. And just as someone, what will be your advice for science journalists who are working in areas where English is the first language, and unlike Tanzania, in which your native language is your communication in all areas? So, for example, like in Kenya, we have 40 plus tribes, and so English to my grandmother will not be relevant. But so what would be advice for people who are getting to science journalism or science communication and working in an area whereby it's not set up particularly for the local language to work for science communication?
Yeah, sure. I think if I should begin with the benefits are immense, because if you can play your part in increasing access of science information to the people who understand this native language better, I think you've played a very big part of your journalism career. It's also, it may not be a lucrative area in terms of financial returns. It's rather, I should say, dedication to serve. Yeah. So in a country where, like Kenya, you have, vernaculars here and there, I think there are platforms where these people speak vernaculars run too. If you have community radios, if you have community radios in Kenya, are there community radios that communicate in the native languages?
Yes, they actually have the highest number of listeners.
Yes. So yeah. I think this is a platform where if you bring in aspects of science and try to engage with the listeners about science, but you have to do it creatively, because you can't go there and start speaking of p-value or talking about prevalence very tough stuff for the communities. People want to hear how that science is relatable to them.
Yeah.
Want to hear how that science is solving their problems.
Mm-hmm.
People want to hear if it is raising their hopes, but then as a responsible journalist, you have to raise their hopes. You don't raise false hopes.
Mm-hmm.
You have to use credible evidence. But then if it is something that they are being warned about that creates fear, it should not be unwarranted fear. But these are the aspects that people look for. They want things that will give them hope. People will come, information that will calm down their tensions, information that will help them find the solutions, information that is relevant to them.
Mm-hmm.
So if your story has these characteristics, but it is science. If it is science, it means taking it to the people using those specific areas that people find information in.
Mm-hmm.
That can be, I think, a better option. Like we talked of an example of community radios.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you have a few newspapers like Taifa Leo. There is that group of people who like Taifa Leo.
Yeah.
They buy the newspaper. Why do they like it? Probably because they like the Swahili.
Mm-hmm.
There are people who speak Kalenjin or who speak any other language in Kenya. You know those tribes very well. And now, where do the Kalenjin, in their Kalenjin language, if at all it exists, where do they seek information in that? How best do they want it, and where do they get it? Mm. Now, as a science journalist who is aspiring to communicate to the local people in that way, I think those are the platforms to offer them information, or even creating platforms of that nature and expanding the base.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, actually, that can be a way to find the avenue to it.
I think it's a very good point in terms of concluding this conversation. I'm going to want to thank you so much for taking the time, and also giving us it's interesting with the perspective of a science communicator, science journalist, but also somebody who's doing capacity building also for other people within the science space. And thank you so much for creating the time, and hope to have a conversation again.